I'm Fred Cummins from University College Dublin, and I was utterly terrified by the theme of this colloquium. What's next for theories of embodiment in philosophy and cognitive science, to be considered in two senses, one with respect to 4E enactive and ecological approaches, and one given the state of the world and someone called the human's place in it. What comes next and what can we do? Those are utterly terrifying themes, and I am not equipped to address them. When we ask about the future, I'm going to assume that you and I share a concern that some kind of radical restructuring of our understanding of ourselves and our position in the world is necessary. We often gestured to this with the notions such as ecological thinking, in which our embedding in the biosphere and its perilous state are considered, relational thinking, in which we try to move towards a more intersubjective or mutual way of constructing a shared world. And the theme of embodiment means that we're centering the body. How on earth could you address these? I'm going to wave my hands a lot, and I'm going to talk about the thoroughly old-fashioned notion of the soul as we go along, and I hope that doesn't scare you. The reasons for that will become clear. Whatever about what's next, a future as revealed by a scientific outlook at the moment looks rather dismal. We find ourselves in the middle of a pandemic. So the virus has alerted us to global catastrophe that can potentially influence all of human society all at once, with devastating consequences. And the virus has made an awful lot of things clearer. It's made it clear that our concepts of nature, of society, of culture, and of the sovereign are all in need of interrogation. It might be unusual to link those four together. The impossibility of separating nature from culture, for example, is something that many of us have long subscribed to. The social order is often assumed, but it's also one of the most, obviously the most contested possible area to which we contribute. But the sovereign belongs in there as well, as we're going to trace some history here in this talk. And in that time, the secular sovereign, the forces that rule us, the states, emperors, are also going to play an important role. But the virus is today, and we know that we find ourselves in the middle of utterly devastating processes of climate change that are going to make human living as we have understood it impossible. And when it comes to climate change, these four core concepts are also threatened: nature, society, culture, and the sovereign. And then behind the disaster of climate change, we know we're in the middle of a mass extinction. So we're seeing before our eyes huge amounts of biodiversity collapse. And again, I suggest nature, society, culture, and the sovereign all stand as concepts which have, by and large, got by without much questioning or critical appraisal, and are now all collectively threatened. If that's the future, then the future is dismal. But is that the future? And for whom would that be the future? The answer to this question and the perspective we take on it depends who and what we think we are, where we find our position in the world, what we think we are continuous with, and what we see as so threatened by these. What is it that we think is at risk of dying out? And a conventional answer here will appeal to some notion of humanity. Indeed, the text for the colloquium appeals to some notion of humanity. And that just won't do. The word human means too many things. It's usually used simply as a sense of invoking a sense of commonality with anyone with whom we discourse. I assume you're human. It is not well grounded in any science, in any of our practices. in the way we run our lives, the human is an ideal which we will interrogate as we go along. But as we do so, we're going to, of course, to make use of science. And despite the fact that I'm going to be discussing the soul, I'm a scientist of a sort. So let me distinguish clearly between two senses of the term science. My preferred sense, on the left, is a practice of dialogical realism which facilitates joint actionable consensus. This seems to me to be a useful way to view the activities of science as the four big concepts of nature, culture, society, and the sovereign are critiqued. Science tends to be invoked as a simple beacon of truth, which in a secular context is a little bit odd. And one of the weird things about our present position is that this way of treating of science has entirely destroyed our ability to talk about cultural variety, religious variety. And I'm going to draw freely from the thoughts that are available to me, the ideas that are available to me. I live in 21st century Ireland, and you swim in slightly different currents, but we share some, or you wouldn't be partaking in this somewhat asymmetrical dialogue. We can identify many commonalities in the ideas from which we draw. We haven't all read the same books. We don't all subscribe to the same favorite authors. But I'm going to look back at how the treatment of the body and the soul came to their current spot, and how embodied cognitive science has something very important to offer here. I'm going to start off, I'm going to make a lot of use of images in this talk, so here's something frightening for you. The image on the right you're well familiar with. It is, of course, Leonardo da Vinci's famous Vitruvian Man, drawn not merely as a guide to artists to get the proportions of the body correct, which is very difficult if you've ever tried to draw it, but the idea of man as the measure of all things, the mean as an ideal form, enclosed by a circle, gives a very strong indication of how ideas are coming together. The circle is a geometric figure which represents, as it were, perfect containment. And within this, we have the idealized figure of the individual body. Now, this is Vitruvian Man, a production of the Renaissance. And so our idealized body here is male, about 25, got ripped abs, all those normative questions obtain. And this is, however, has served, this kind of idealization has served the business of the construction of the person from at least the Renaissance on. The figure on the left you're not familiar with, I'm going to guess. It's a curse figure from ancient Mesopotamia. And this particular person has been bound up and has all of their senses clogged up. All of their senses are stoppered, leaving them bound, as it were, leaving the soul of this creature bound within its body, unable to engage with the world. This, I fear, is the curse that we have inherited from the circle drawn too tightly around the idealized individual male, etc. body. Now, a distinguishing feature of Christian approaches to the body and to the person is that the soul has been viewed as entombed, contained within the body. I've placed the person here in parentheses because I wish to regard the person as a concept that is not defined, not fixed, never to be fixed. But of course, in our discourse, we take attitudes with respect to persons, and the substantive contribution of the Christian figures of thought here is to identify the body and the soul. Now you can see this if you study the elaboration of this role, you can see that certain Christian sects get very engaged and exercised about whether bodies will be available on the day of resurrection. What if they're rotted? Will there be men and women in heaven? And so on. So there are all kinds of peculiar puzzles, as usual in questions of religion, but they center around this identification of the soul with the body. And I'm going to go back to the point at which this identification becomes most prominent, which is in late antiquity. I'm going to suggest to you that there were multiple views available at the time, and that Christianity developed one specific view, and we'll see what the consequences of that are. Just to show you that this is quite a general way of understanding our predicament, let's just note that I think you're all familiar with three kinds of zombies. Usually we try to keep these three kinds of zombies entirely distinct. And I want to show that they share a common characteristic. That's why they're zombies. The first one is, of course, the white panic about Haitian ritual practices. I'm not going to say anything about Haitian ritual practices. But the white zombie, illustrated here, was a fearful figure. And the soul that is threatened here is, of course, the white nationalist Christian soul. And the idea that such a body could be possessed by a different soul was utterly horrific. So we see a certain kind of panic at the idea of other forms of animation of the body. Now, George A. Romero brought this to a high art with his magnificent series of zombie films, in which bodies which are differently animated, they're the undead, so they're not alive like us, yet they're animated. And what are they animated by? And Romero shows us how the bodies are animated mindlessly by things like capitalism. Absolutely brilliant treatment, but there's a great deal of continuity. These are bodies animated by forces that you don't want to be animated by. And Dave Chalmers, who introduced the philosophical zombie, who walks and talks like a person, but there's no light on inside. Well, that idea of no light on being inside, no light on inside, that is the same fear. It's the idea that there's something essential to the body, as we understand it, that could be absent, and that the body could be wrongly animated, even to the point of indistinguishability. So I just want to use those zombies to point out that those three represent a single fear, which is rooted in the singular identification of the soul with the body. And now we're going to go back to late antiquity. And the central figure here, as I'm going to draw the story, is St. Augustine. Of course, picking out individual figures when we're talking about large historical currents of thought is a fool's game. But Augustine is extremely important here. He lived at the end of the 4th century. At that time, Christianity was one of a vast array of cults, schools, we might say religions, social orders that were competing, where matters that we consider theological, philosophical, political were all debated, hotly contested, very, very lively intellectual time. Augustine sits at a crucial point here where Christianity had just got married to power. It was the Emperor Constantine who first of all granted Christians religious freedom and restored the properties that had been taken away from them. And then later on, it was a different Emperor, Diocletian, I think, who made it the official religion of the Roman Empire. And that gave rise to an intertangling of Christian ideas with authority and power. This is why the sovereign is extremely important in here. But at the time of Augustine, we have a mixture of many kinds of ideas, and I'm only going to focus on Greek and Christian ideas, but one could put in significant others, particularly from Persia here. But among the Greek contributions at this time in late antiquity, we've got well-developed mathematics going all the way back to the mysticism of Pythagoras. We've got logic coming down to us from Aristotle. We've got the Greek idea of the Greek beginnings of the construction of the person. The person here is a contested term. As a constituent in the social order, in the state order, there's the sovereign again, and the co-definition of the person. And we've got very, very many rights, practices, agencies. The antique world was very Catholic in a sense that is utterly distinct from the Roman Catholic Apostolic Church. It was Catholic in that certain pristine figures of thought found application in many culturally, spiritually diverse traditions. To this great soup, now, Christianity added many innovations, and this is only to follow one thread. But the doctrine of the incarnation centered the body and centered the individual body, offering individual salvation and the promise of individual freedom. And all this happened at the time, in late antiquity, where this contribution to philosophy became married with state authority. Now, there were other ways that the soul could have been developed at this time. Augustine's principal influence is perhaps Plotinus, who was a Neoplatonic philosopher who sort of developed the religious and deeply mysterious work of Plato into an intellectual doctrine, a mystical doctrine that was very pristine and minimalist. Plotinus was no friend of the body. He regarded the soul as entombed in the body, and this was one thing that Augustine picked up strongly from him. Augustine revered Plotinus. But Plotinus influenced others who developed the soul in other ways. And while we're following this particular Christian elaboration, Christian and state elaboration of the soul, we might remember that Plotinus's wonderful formal insights, which are beautiful, I highly recommend them, they were developed in other ways too. And my favorite character here is the philosopher Iamblichus, who, instead of entombing the soul within the body, allowed for a fully embodied being to participate in a host of other agencies, a menagerie of demons, angels, archangels, heroes, archons, hypercosmic gods, multiply animating the body in a manner that allowed free expression within very many traditions. Iamblichus went on to influence Sufi thought and Sufi practices a lot. So Plotinus was not either the first or the last word, but he represents a crucial point, and one strand diverging from him is the one we get with Augustine. And so I'm going to draw a picture of how the body and the soul appear in Augustine. Then that's Winnie the Pooh. That's Winnie the Pooh's bum, actually, and there's the other side of Winnie the Pooh. Winnie the Pooh, the embodied being, finds himself suspended between two realms. He's gone down the rabbit hole, taken the red pill, and now he's stuck. His bum is in the material world. His bum is chthonic, earthbound, material, while his head is all intellect and nous. But he's stuck, he's wedged. His soul, by being trapped in this way, cannot either act sensibly in the earthly interior realm of the cave, nor can it enjoy the intellectual liberty. And I can't help noticing that this little image that I've chosen as iconic shows you also something that we need to take account of, which is supplication. I can't help noticing the graphic similarity between little Rue offering the bear a bunch of flowers here and the traditional position of the flowers in the figure of the Virgin Mary. For one thing that all such wisdom traditions have always done is provide a means of supplication, some means of appealing to, we say, a higher authority because we're in that tradition, something beyond oneself in which one can have confidence. And as we'll see, the scientific tradition has not developed means for providing supplication. So, the scientific treatment of the body is not independent of these currents. It has been built upon this singular foundation. And as we trace European and global currents of thought from late antiquity to 2021, we see that this is the cauldron in which the notions of nature, culture, society, and the sovereign have all stewed. Those were never fixed notions. They have emerged under conditions in which the soul has been trapped in the body, as it were, is limited to the body. It's the body seen as singularly animated by a single soul. Now, we were talking about religions, and now we're talking about science. What just happened? Well, most practitioners of science and all of the historical antecedents of science were informed by these, and they inform our thoughts as well, whether we like it or not. Now, a little personal note is in order here. I grew up in Ireland in the 1960s and 70s, when Ireland was a theocracy. The politicians bowed to the church, And that was simply unquestioned. And it wasn't until the 90s and even the noughties that we managed to free ourselves from that. Now, the theocracy in question gave up practically unlimited power to clerics, and they knew that the bishops had their back, and the politicians had only limited range to do anything that was not favoured by the bishops and the clerics. The institution, of course, was the Holy Roman Apostolic, the Catholic Church, as we conventionally call it, and there the sense of Catholic is entirely different from what I meant before, right? Previously, I meant Catholic in the sense of making use of archetypal, simple forms, which can then find exegesis in local, culturally differentiated manners. That's a very useful sense of Catholic. Now, here we're referring to a particularly problematic institution. And one of the reasons that that institution lost its power was because it led to enormous abuses, some of the most famous ones being the abuse of children, women, orphans. As hideous stories came out, people simply stopped accepting the authority of the Catholic Church in Ireland, thank heavens. Why do I tell this personal note? Because I see science as recapitulating the same problem. A science done without an ethical awareness of the role of measurement becomes another theocracy. It is just as capable of systematic abuse, and it can be used to support authoritarian practices, much like the Catholic Church in Ireland at the time. What in Ireland at that time was the blind appeal to the authority of the cleric appears in a contemporary context as the blind belief that data exist without attachments. That is surely an all-pervasive belief at the moment, and one that we need urgently to question. So, I said I was going to talk about souls, and so far I haven't talked much about souls. I can't find souls anymore. That Christian notion didn't pan out, and the person became constructed now as a singly animated body. And if you want a statement of faith, here's one. We are multiply animated. I don't think it's too controversial to suggest that any single causal account for what we do in the course of a day is going to be lacking. But we have inherited a problematic tradition. The constructive fiction of the psychological subject, that is, the subject conceived of as a singular locus of consciousness, who perceives the world, draws on memory, uses the process of attention. All of these ways are utterly conventional ways of talking about ourselves, have been constructed under these circumstances. Now, you cannot rewind history. We can't undo this. Embodied cognitive science can contribute here, not by overthrowing the fiction of the psychological subject, because we would then be utterly destitute. We would have no ways of talking about ourselves. But what we can contribute is a means of scaffolding the kind of wisdom and skill that is obtainable using scientific methods. A simplistic treatment of objectivity, and therewith the denigration of the subject, is not sufficient to act as a foundation for the ethical employment of scientific method and skill. Most of us are aware of this. Data, as construed within, for example, contemporary data science, are purely objective in this sense. And when we speak theories of embodiment, I'm not just talking about add-ons to psychological theory. I'm taking mind and life seriously here. And I'm assuming that we're more or less aware of the tradition, which is traditionally traced from Varela Thompson-Rosh, maybe Evan Thompson's Mind and Life book, which I take very seriously indeed. And one of the central figures of this, and here's another, as it were, Platonic figure of thought that can be developed in Catholic ways in different specific cases, is the cell, the lone cell swimming up the chemotactic gradient. I assume you're familiar with this because it's used to illustrate and articulate very many quite important, complex formal characteristics of an inactive account. The cell provides the case of the autopoietic self-producing being with a boundary between itself and the world. The world, in this simple characterization, is always just a single gradient, but the gradient is relevant and organizes, as it were, the activity of the cell. Furthermore, the inactive discussion should always add to this that we recognize our role as the observer here in carving up the flux of everything, in identifying the cell and its world. One might introduce the language of the re-entry, a technical term from some of the formalisms employed by Varela. This is when the distinction that you draw in a domain of discourse is re-entered into your world, as it were. And this process of re-entry never stops. We, as embodied beings, are always called upon to find ourselves in the world. So I want to introduce a few more figures like this mythical cell swimming up the gradient. And the first one I want to introduce is the loopy body. That body you see there looks a bit like a person, could be a starfish, could be just a blob. So it's not yet a human, not even an organism, and most certainly not an animal. I want to introduce this as a means of suggesting that we need to be far more careful in our distinctions between persons, organisms, systems, and especially animals. But we are familiar with the body as a locus of our attention within embodied cognitive science, and we are aware that the body is hooked into the world, that the body participates in the world, and that the motion, the twitchings of the body only make sense when we consider the multitude of manners in which it is hooked into the world. Now, in most elaborations these days, that's simply sensory motor embedding, and I mean to suggest something far more profound and at vastly different timescales. Sensory motor embedding is one thing. But there's also the embedding of history. There's embedding through the social material environment that humans have built themselves. There's embedding in cultural traditions. There's all kinds of embedding in the world, all these loops which animate the body. So the body is multiply animated at multiple temporal and spatial scales. I want to just pit this figure against the familiar figure for sense-making, which I think is one of the most pristine, beautiful, I will say again, Platonic concepts to come out of the inactive literature. And our two diagrams here are almost identical. I have reduced all those loops, in typical Platonic fashion, to a single hula hoop going around the middle of the body here. And on the right, in the conventional articulation of sense-making, we have the autonomous system engaging in regulated exchange with its world. So there's only two figures here. The loopy body here is more like Winnie the Pooh. That is, the activity of the body in the world provides the nexus for the link between the lower and the upper, between the interior of the cave and the heavens, between the body and the intellect, between the material characteristics of our being and our intellectual faculties. We think in these ways all the time. We see ourselves always, because we can't get away from the figure of the soul, we see ourselves always as somehow between two domains. The old alchemical principle of as above, so below expresses a belief that these can ultimately be unified through the figure of the body. So, in a sense, I've taken the Platonic figure of sense-making and turned it into a Catholic figure of the loopy body, which dances somewhere between two realms. Now, participatory sense-making, another wonderful innovation, formal innovation, very Platonic, from the inactive tradition, extends to this framework as well. And let's just see some elaborations of this, shall we? Because what I wanted to suggest was that embodied cognitive science can contribute to this horrendously complex situation we find ourselves in by scaffolding the manner in which we apply scientific methods and scientific inquiry. Instead of the simple subject-object divide, or subjectivity-objectivity, I want to suggest that we have available to us three frames of discourse that we need to keep separated. The first frame is the framework of the travails of matter and energy, often expressed in the vocabulary of the physical and inorganic chemical sciences, but not exclusively. This has to do with materialism. Within this frame, we have made enormous progress. Our understanding of the physical universe, our understanding of long time, our understanding of fine components of matter, all these have told us an awful lot. Within this frame, there is no recourse to the notion of function or purpose. That is simply not available. When you describe the motion of the planets around the sun, you cannot pull an Aristotle and suggest that anything wants to be anywhere. Time in this frame is the familiar chronological metric that extends in units of seconds. What have we learned so far in our several hundred years of inquiry in this mode is we have learned that there are non-negotiable conditions of being. Alan Sokal inviting you to jump out of his window is one rather unfortunate and impolite way of expressing this. We can always ask further about the non-negotiable conditions of being, but there's one further result. If I might summarize the entirety of the physical sciences in two results, one is that there's non-negotiable conditions of being. The other is that they always draw our attention to the embodied being. For the more we lay out a physicalist theory of the universe, the more we understand the body as central. Why? Well, first of all, there's matters of scale. Modern physics deals with the impossibly large or impossibly small or impossibly long or impossibly short, has lost all contact with the mesoscopic world of tables and teapots that we inhabit. So as we learn more about physics, we're always drawn back to the midpoint at which we started to articulate our questions, and that midpoint is, of course, the body. Furthermore, within this story of matter and energy, at the end of the 19th century, thermodynamics entered the picture. And that gave this chronometric scale a single direction. Things fall apart. That too draws our attention to the embodied being, for the embodied being is, of course, a little anti-entropic vortex. Now, this frame allows us to cast the body and its antics in a particular way. And I want to suggest, as we get rid of Vitruvian man, we can use a Vitruvian organism in this frame, and I'm going to suggest the beetle, the dung beetle specifically. It's always useful to have a concrete example. The dung beetle gives a nice illustration of the anti-entropic vortex that the embodied being is, and furthermore, it encourages us to view ourselves in some ways that we absolutely need to view ourselves. If we're looking at ourselves and the beetle is the Vitruvian organism, we're not going to get hung up on the notion of species. Have you ever seen how many beetles there are and how wonderfully varied? Species is just not relevant here. Furthermore, we understand the dung beetle, to the extent that we understand it at all, together with the dung. And we urgently need to understand the embodied antics of Homo sapiens, together with its dung, its pollution, its scarification of the planet, its resource consumption and dumping. This gives us a very external view of the embodied organism, and we always view it together with the dung. So this is a wonderful result from physics that is never discussed. So the second frame I want to suggest that we use is the frame of the organism or the embodied being. And here, the major theoretical contribution has been autopoiesis. Autopoiesis provides a new frame in the history of science within which the activity of an embodied being is self-producing. That single distinction opens up whole new conversations that we can have. We can talk about the participation by components in wholes that are organized by a single gradient. And with that starting point, then the exegesis of the very complicated notions of environments, worlds, the whole, and the notion of participation in something becomes available to us. But this is also a restricted frame. There's only a limited number of concepts we can do, and the analogies we make to our own being in the world, only some of them can come from this frame. So I'm going to suggest a jellyfish as a Vitruvian organism for this frame. There's something chthonic about the jellyfish. That was the first point in the evolutionary series when nervous systems and muscles co-appeared, for example. They're very simple animals in some sense. And they provide us not with a single figure of thought. The beetle is a single figure, although the beetle needs to be considered with its dung. With this Vitruvian organism, we can consider the organism within its world, and its world is maximally simple. We think of the blue open ocean. But we can also consider the position of a cell within the ecology of the organism itself. So we have multiple perspectives available to us now. When we adopt this frame, the word time means something different. Time is not chronometric, and seconds are at best an indirect way to measure anything. Time arises in relation between X and Y. The time of the living is not clock time, it's the time of pulse. And you'll notice, if you could, when your heart starts beating, because that's in the your time. In this framework, we view things as organized by a single gradient. In the case of the jellyfish, gravity lends itself. So this provides us with one way of viewing sensory motor embedding that gets us a bit away from that Mesopotamian curse doll with its sensory epistemology based on intake of information. The jellyfish actually provides us with a wonderful Vitruvian sensory organ, the statolith. That's the little circle inside the body of the jellyfish I've drawn there. It's a chamber lined with cilia and containing a single small stone. How beautiful is that? It means whatever angle the jellyfish is at, there is available to it information with respect to a single gradient. So this gives us a way of refounding our sensory epistemology without appeal to synapses. Cilia in this frame provide the best model of sense-making. Not brains, not nerves. The organism here has the maximally simple world of the open ocean, but we can also ask and consider the role of the cell within the organism, because the cell within the organism also has a single gradient. That is the autopoietic activity, self-producing activity of the organism. So the cell has a gradient given by the autopoiesis of the jellyfish, and the jellyfish has a gradient given by gravity, perhaps light. Now, these are forms. These are formal contributions. Further exegesis might consider the organ as an intermediary role between cell and whole. And notice if we do that, we're back to precisely the kind of discussion that was going on in late antiquity about the relationship between souls and the one. So those are two frames. What's the third frame? The third frame will not be so bounded. The third frame is the vocative. It's where we are right now. The first frame is an idealized frame within which we cannot appeal to function and in which time appears as an undifferentiated chronometric continuum with the addition of the thermodynamic gradient. In the second frame, we see the organism, and time arises in the interaction of the living, a completely different sense of time. There is no appeal to some conventional terms that we use like information is not available within this frame. We have limited appeal to function because function has to be grounded in the superordinate organizing whole. And so we won't find good and evil there. Predator and prey are on equal footing. The third frame where we discourse, this is where we are. This is where we're conducting the business of science. And we do so, we address each other in the vocative, not in the first person or the third person. These are linguistic constructs, dear me. So in frame one, time is second after second after second after second. In frame two, we get relations of mutuality. In frame three, history can now be constructed. History arises and we can appeal to anything we like. Your culture, my culture, evolution, whatever. Don't confuse it with the cosmology of Big Bang and Big Crunch. That comes from the first frame. Here we meet each other and we recognize each other, and to the extent that you recognize someone else, you are addressing them as an ensouled being. This has been a constant the whole time. Can we come up with a Vitruvian figure for this? Well, we won't find it among animals. I want to suggest a Vitruvian figure for this third frame, and I want to suggest a monastery. A monastery is a human activity. They've been around for a while. In a monastery, a bunch of monks voluntarily submit to a single overarching gradient. We can find examples of this. The rule of St. Benedict, for example, has been around for 1400 years, and we still find thriving monasteries where people voluntarily submit to this, and that single voluntary submission to an overall gradient organizes everything within the monastery. And within that, life in the monastery is wonderfully diverse, creative, and fertile. But the Vitruvian monastery gives us the example to discuss the differentiation of roles, for example, which has to happen within a monastery. A monastery exists in a complex set of regulated exchanges with its environment, which is a contemporary human social environment, and we can discuss those. A monastery living also demonstrates something very important about the manner in which human collectivities come together. It is refreshed regularly through practices of liturgy and chant. So that's a third Vitruvian figure we can place beside the dung beetle in his dung, the jellyfish, and the monastery. So to come back to the question, what next? What future? Well, the way that you treat time and the way that you recognize your own being among the souls of the world, from the blade of grass to the human scholar, shapes all possible answers to such questions. Obviously, I can't give any answers. These questions are far too big. But it's possible to lose heart because the public discourse around science is so utterly bankrupt. The social institutions we live in, many of their more public aspects, are revealing themselves to be far less trustworthy than we thought. And furthermore, we stand before imminent challenges that we have of a kind we've never met before. So who are our allies here? I've taken this very broad stance, not to get bogged down, as I obviously haven't, in detailed questions about any particular elaboration of the body in embodied cognitive science. But we have allies in critical realism, in subtle realism, in posthumanism, in the agential realism of Karen Barad, in integral ecology, in the various forms of new materialisms, or the integration of the cosmos and the politics, Isabella Stenger's work, the kind of critical anthropology that Tim Ingold brings to bear. Animism is no longer to be dismissed when we realize that, oh, well, we have our own form of animism, and it's the Winnie the Pooh animism that St. Augustine gifted us with. The critical study of science in science and technology studies, feminist and queer theory that have been chiseling away at these particular dispensable constructs that have brought about such impoverished notions of what the person is. And all of this looks thoroughly unscientific, doesn't it? Don't forget the role of artists, because this requires some kind of a realignment, a refashioning of our thinking. So we have lots of allies. Lots of conventional concepts are threatened. The manner in which nature is invoked as a god, and often it's, oddly enough, the demiurge of the economy. It's worth thinking about nature and economy in classic old views of creator making everything natural, and then some lesser god coming along and messing it all up, because we're told the economy is a god, right? You can't change it. You can't do that because of the economy. Another thing that's threatened is the notion of language as a medium of translation, a thoroughly Christian notion. And this is how I got into this. I'm a linguist, and I see that notion as really in severe need of critique. We are all concerned with health at the moment, which is traditionally divided into somatic health and mental health. Mental health being the dustbin into which we put all the problems of our own forms of social organization. That needs interrogation urgently. The hegemony of data science and the manner in which data is treated as if it came from nowhere, as if a measurement had no attachments, was independent of the person and the motivation and the funding with which that data point was collected, and that yields political authority to the cleric who wields it. This is such a problem at the moment, and it is a reprise of the problem of theocracy. And as embodied cognitive scientists, we have a hard time with the word psychology. Psychology and the psychological subject belong firmly in the third frame. They cannot be conducted within the other two frames. There is no role for consciousness. There is no privileged role for the brain. In fact, the manner in which you approach the brain will now have to be negotiated and seen as a cultural convention. So we've a lot of thinking to do. We've developed many useful figures of thought. I mean, most of our mathematical practices are nothing more than useful figures of thought. And they blend across the traditions. So I've added a few here, just for stimulating some thinking. To the inactive cell, I've added the loopy body, the Vitruvian dung beetle, the Vitruvian jellyfish in all its complexity, and the Vitruvian monastery. And the goal here, What next for cognitive science? Wouldn't it be great if we could get Winnie the Pooh out of that hole, if we could pull together and land him back in his loopy body? Wouldn't that be good? That's my dream. Thank you very much. I have no idea how the panel discussion is going to go. The theme was far too big. I hope that was intelligible at least, and everything in there is a topic I would love to engage in further discussion, elaboration, and exegesis of. Thank you very much. There's a few of my relevant URLs there.